My name is Nelson Mandela, and at 35 years old, the year was 1948, and I could feel the cold steel of injustice tightening around the necks of my people like a noose that would strangle the very breath of freedom from our lungs. I stood at the crossroads between submission and resistance, between the safety of silence and the dangerous path of defiance that would define not only my destiny, but the fate of millions of my fellow South Africans who had been condemned to live as strangers in their own homeland. When the National Party's victory brought forth the architect of apartheid into power, I watched as the nightmare that had haunted our land for generations was given legal form and governmental blessing, transforming our beautiful country into a prison where the color of one's skin determined whether they would live as masters or servants, whether they would walk through the front door or crawl through the back, whether they would be treated as human beings or as mere shadows existing on the periphery of a society that refused to acknowledge their humanity. As I accepted my position as National Secretary of the African National Congress Youth League and joined the National Executive of the ANC, representing the Transvaal, I could sense that my life was no longer my own, but belonged to something far greater than my individual aspirations or personal comfort. The weight of responsibility pressed down upon my shoulders like the heavy burden carried by Atlas, yet instead of feeling crushed by this enormous load, I found myself growing stronger, more determined and increasingly convinced that the time for polite requests and gentle protests had passed like morning mist before the rising sun of a new and more militant dawn. By 1949, as I was elevated to the Executive Council of the ANC, the full horror of the apartheid system began to reveal itself through a series of laws designed not merely to separate the races but to destroy the very soul of Black South Africa, to reduce proud peoples with rich histories and vibrant cultures to nothing more than cheap labor for the white minority government that had seized control of our nation as political and economic machinery with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine designed for oppression. The Johannesburg International Club became my window into what South Africa could become if we could somehow break free from the chains of racial prejudice that bound us all black and white alike, a system that diminished our shared humanity. It was there that I met remarkable individuals, like the American actors Canada Lee and Sidney Poitier, whose very presence in our segregated society represented a glimpse of the integrated world that dreamed of creating, where talent and character would matter more than the accident of birth that determined one's racial classification. My friendship with Gordon Goose and his wife Ursula taught me profound lessons about the absurdity and cruelty of apartheid's racial boundaries, particularly when I accompanied Ursula, who was visually impaired. From her workplace, and experienced firsthand the venomous hatred that erupted from white passers-by who could not comprehend the simple human decency of one person helping another regardless of race. Their fury at seeing a black man walking arm in arm with a white woman revealed the psychological poison that apartheid had injected into the bloodstream of our society, turning natural human compassion into something that could be interpreted as criminal defiance. When I was elected president of the ANCYL in 1951 and subsequently became president of the ANC in the Transvaal province the following year, effectively making me the national vice president of our organization, I understood that I was no longer merely Nelson Mandela, the young lawyer from rural Transkei, but had become a symbol of resistance whose every action would be scrutinized, whose every word would carry the hopes and dreams of millions of people who had been denied their basic human dignity for far too long. The government's new segregationist laws of 1950 demonstrated their intention to not merely control the black population, but to systematically destroy our communities, as evidenced by the forced removal of more than 50,000 people from Sophiatown in Johannesburg in 1953, treating human beings like unwanted furniture that could be discarded and relocated at the whim of bureaucrats who saw us as nothing more than statistical entries in their grand design of racial engineering. Initially, I found myself disagreeing with Walter Sisulu's proposal to accept non-African members into the ANC, clinging to the belief that our liberation must come from within our own ranks. But time and experience would teach me that the struggle against apartheid was ultimately a struggle for human rights that transcended racial boundaries and required the participation of all people of conscience, regardless of their ethnic background or skin color. The Defiance Campaign, launched on June 26, 1952, marked my transformation from a behind-the-scenes organizer to a national spokesperson. and leader as thousands of brave South Africans deliberately violated apartheid laws by using facilities designated for whites only, knowing full well that their acts of civil disobedience would result in arrest, imprisonment, and punishment under a legal system designed to protect white privilege and maintain black subjugation. My arrest alongside Indian leader Yusuf Kashalia and other comrades filled me with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration, as I realized that each day spent in prison was simultaneously a badge of honor and a testament to our commitment to justice. Even though the 9-month sentence of hard labor that I received along with 19 other defendants under the Suppression of Communism Act served as a stark reminder of the price that those who dared to challenge apartheid would be forced to pay. The establishment of the law firm Mandela and Tambo in 1952 provided me with both a professional platform from which to serve my community and a front-row seat to witness the daily injustices that the apartheid system inflicted upon ordinary people who sought nothing more than fair treatment under the law, representing hundreds of cases involving black clients who had been denied basic legal protections simply because of their race, leading me to conclude that the apartheid regime had given law and order a bad reputation. My 1953 speech in Suffolktown marked a pivotal moment in my political evolution, as I publicly declared for the first time that the era of passive resistance had ended and that new methods of struggle would be necessary to achieve our liberation. Though I remained committed to the ANC's official policy of nonviolence, despite growing pressure from younger members who argued that peaceful protest had proven ineffective against an increasingly repressive government, the creation of the Congress of the People in 1954 under Chief Albert Luthuli, its leadership represented our attempt to unite all non-white South Africans in a common struggle against racial oppression, culminating in the historic gathering near Soweto at Kliptown in June 1955, where approximately 3,000 people assembled to draft a vision of a democratic South Africa, demonstrating that despite police surveillance and government intimidation, the spirit of resistance could not be crushed by authoritarian force. When my banning order expired in September 1955, I seized the opportunity to travel throughout the Transkei for 2 weeks, reconnecting with family and friends while simultaneously working to expand the ANC's influence in rural areas through public speeches and private meetings, defying police attempts to restrict my movements and discovering that the hunger for freedom burned just as brightly in the remote villages of my childhood as it did in the townships of Johannesburg. Looking back at these formative years of struggle, I realized that my journey from a young lawyer to a leader of the liberation movement was not just a personal transformation, but a reflection of the broader awakening that was taking place throughout South Africa, as ordinary people began to understand that freedom would not be granted as a gift from benevolent rulers but would have to be seized through courage, sacrifice, and unwavering determination. The lessons learned during this period would guide me through the decades of imprisonment and struggle that lay ahead, ultimately leading to the dismantling of apartheid and the birth of a democratic South Africa. For those seeking to understand the historical significance of Nelson Mandela's early activism, the anti-apartheid movement, South African liberation struggles, civil rights, leadership, and the transformation from apartheid to democracy these years represent the foundation upon which the entire liberation movement was built, demonstrating how one person's commitment to justice can ignite a revolution that changes the course of history.